It's an honor to be part of this, and I join Fred in complimenting the authors on the study. This is really a Bible, as have been the previous editions of this, for sanctions, in particular now, I think, on what to do and what not to do if one is determined to go down this road. And I commend it to both people on the Hill and certainly the next administration. Before they do anything, they ought to look at this, and at least if they're going to do something, they can do it more intelligently, I think, as a result of having gone through this manual. USA Engage, which is that part of the National Foreign Trade Council that works on this, is an advocacy organization. We represent large multinational companies, so we are less dispassionate and less scholarly on the issues as the authors. And so you're going to get from me just a bit more of a rant than you got from them, but at the same time it's going to be short, so you can put up with it. I want to make just a couple comments. One, with respect to the book, I've already, I think, given you our bottom line on it. I would simply say, to the extent that we might differ a bit, is we tend to look at sanctions not simply in terms of whether the articulated policy goal was achieved, which is an appropriate measurement for the analytical model they've used. We tend to look at it more from the standpoint of what Jeff alluded to at the end of his remarks about whether the benefits exceed the costs. And one benefit, of course, is achieving the policy goal. There are, however, costs that are harder to measure, and I think are not always measured in the analysis that they've done. And the costs fall into the large category of collateral damage that Jeff alluded to. For us, that damage is really in two parts. One, on the companies and businesses in the sender country, to use their term, which means my members. But the damage also oftentimes falls on the poor people in the target country, who generally are not intended to be the victim or the target of the sanctions, which generally are focused on changing the behavior of the government. But you find in some cases, I think Burma was a good example, that some of the restrictions that are imposed end up having their primary impact on the people that are at least in a position to do anything about it, at least in a position to defend themselves. That's a cost. We would probably, in doing a calculation, probably find more cases where the costs exceed the benefits than the book has found using the model they've used. But on the other hand, I think they have taken an approach which is probably analytically sounder. The other thing I would say that the book comments on that Kim alluded to, which I think is important, is in terms of the way the debate is evolving, not the sanctions. We are seeing, I think, on the good side, I think, much more of a recognition when we lobby on these issues on the Hill and in state legislatures, much more of a recognition of the limitations of these sanctions. We find more and more people saying to us, we understand that these are not likely to work. Sometimes they go so far as to say, we understand that these are stupid. But then there's the big but, and the but is, but we have to do something. And we've had people on the Hill, we've had state legislatures say in sessions with their colleagues saying, you know, I don't know if it's going to work or not. Maybe it won't work, but we have to do something. And what they are addressing is the domestic political imperative that the authors alluded to in their presentation. I guess I should be happy that I think more and more of them are recognizing the limitations of the tools that they choose to employ. I think that's a credit both to the previous editions of the book and also some of our work over the years. But that doesn't alter the bottom line situation. There is still a disposition to go ahead and do these things, albeit for admittedly political reasons, which is frustrating for us. We're going through that right now on Iran in a major way. Let me talk briefly about a couple things that are happening in the scene that I think are noteworthy currently. The one that Jeff mentioned particularly is the devolution of sanctions to state and local governments. This is happening notwithstanding litigation that we brought in several cases. So far 100% successfully, although I'm not going to debate Jeff's point about where this might ultimately come out. I think why this is happening in part is because of, frankly, easy targets. You've got people in state legislatures who are not particularly well equipped to make sophisticated foreign policy decisions and are very susceptible to local lobbying efforts by local activist groups. And we've seen this happening over and over again. They're very responsive to these kinds of pressures. The number of states that have passed, that have enacted or are considering Sudan legislation is 34 right now. The number of states that have enacted or are considering Iran legislation is 23 and growing. Next year, these things follow the legislative cycle, which means they tend to be in most states in the spring. Some of these bills are old standbys, including the procurement sanction, which was, we thought, snuffed out by the Supreme Court in the Crosby case, but apparently people in state legislatures have short memories. But also the growing use of divestment situations as a tool. One of our problems with this, well, one thing this does that I think is interesting is it creates a new category of victim, retirees. And this debate in the past has been fought out primarily with respect to impact on governments, impact on large multinational companies who get caught up in their exports or their imports or their impact on financial institutions. Now we have a new group of people, pension holders, who are going to have to bear the consequences of these actions and have been very slow to recognize that there might be implied explicit costs for them. One of the most interesting recent developments a couple weeks ago in Pennsylvania was a successful amendment to one of these bills that required the state to compensate pension funds for any losses that were incurred as a result of divestment. That passed over the objections of the bill's sponsors and has succeeded in slowing the bill down as it moves from the House to the Senate. We'll see how that plays out, but at least it's beginning to be a recognition that these things are not cost-free and that there are, in this case, ordinary citizens, in this case largely, if you want to actually look at the affected parties, they're retired police officers, firefighters, and teachers who have to pay the price, if there is one, for this activity. I could go on about whether or not there's a price, but I'm not going to do that. The larger argument, I think, for this discussion is that from our point of view, this is essentially outsourcing foreign policy. It's taking foreign policy out of the hands of the federal government and evolving it to state legislatures or to the city of Burlington or to the city of Berkeley, California, or Tacoma Park was probably a good early example. This, as I said, I think takes it to people that are probably less equipped to deal with it. This has a number of potential consequences, thus far largely theoretical. My favorite example, of course, is violence breaks out in Kashmir. The state of California, in its infinite wisdom, egged on by its Indian lobby, decides that it's Pakistan's fault and sanctions Pakistan. Michigan, meanwhile, its legislature, under some influence from the large Muslim population in Michigan, decides that it's India's fault and sanctions India. Where does that leave the president in that situation? We're not there yet, far-fetched analogy, but we are going down a road that is going to lead inevitably to that situation. These things also create significant compliance problems for business because in the end, you're stuck not with complying with one federal law, but with 50 different laws. And trust me, they are all different, even though they are articulated in terms of the same policy objectives. They define the terms differently. They have different rules. If, for example, you are a large mutual fund that operates nationwide and you are being told by the state of California that you have to sell certain stocks to divest because of Iran, that's fine. You've done that. California has wisely provided you a legal safe harbor from lawsuits accusing you of breaching your fiduciary duty for the divestment. However, that safe harbor in California doesn't protect you from your New Jersey investors, and the state of New Jersey does not require you to divest that particular stock, and your New Jersey investors are wondering why you did that. So if you're a financial institution, a pension fund, you're faced with this enormous growing mess, which Congress, to its marginal credit, is attempting to deal with. The other problem with these, of course, is that they all rely on proprietary private sector companies to develop their lists of bad entities. In the case of Sudan, these lists range from 23 to, I think, more than 600. So there's quite a wide divergence. In some cases, if you develop your list using word recognition searches, you know, if your K1 mentions the word Sudan, you're on the list, even though the mention is a statement that you've ceased doing business there. This is, you know, these are actual cases. There's a lot of quality problems in the developing of this list, but this is the direction we're going in. The other two directions we're going in have already been mentioned, so I won't go into any great length. One is extraterritorial sanctions. As we eliminate U.S. government, U.S. private sector contact with countries like Iran to the best that sanctions can, we discover that, the Congress discovers that the true culprit in their mind are European, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, whatever companies that are not paying any attention to U.S. sanctions, obviously, and making their own investments there. So we enact extraterritorial sanctions. These have the effect, first of all, of putting the president, who's trying to get cooperation from the very countries whose companies we're sanctioning, in a difficult position. But they also encourage blocking statutes to be erected by the foreign governments that end up putting my members in the impossible position of no matter what they do, they're violating somebody's law, and companies don't like to be in that position. Harry Clark of the law firm Dewey LaBeouf did a wonderful paper for us on blocking sanctions, which is on the USA and Engage website if you want to take a look at it. There have been some recent developments in this area. There's going to be more of them. They also open the door to WTO litigation, which thus far has been hypothetical, but I can tell you from conversations we had, the EU is getting ready to do that should any of the pending Iran bills that do have extraterritorial sanctions end up being enacted. Finally, Jeff and I think Kim both mentioned smart sanctions, which is the idea of very specific targeted sanctions on individuals, often in the financial area. We actually have been more relaxed about those because of their narrow focus and the better job they do of minimizing collateral damage because they are so narrowly focused. We, however, have begun to run into two problems that are, I guess, at best incipient rather than full-blown at this point. One is, of course, if you're going to do this, you need a lot of intelligence and a lot of information to do it right. There's a classic case here where we sanctioned, I think in the Liberian case, Charles Taylor. Makes perfect sense until you realize that if you're a large bank, you probably have 3,000 cardholders and depositors named Charles Taylor. So you try to sort out which one is the Charles Taylor. And one of the things you do, particularly if you have a transaction involving the EU, which you often do, you ask them, can you give us some information about your Charles Taylor so we know that it's not the bad guy? Well, under the EU privacy directive, you can't do that. And so all of a sudden, the web of privacy regulations and bank regulations that other countries have structured for prudential reasons, not for sanction reasons, comes into play that makes these things very difficult and makes it even when you have some information but not enough, it makes it difficult to implement. The other problem we've discovered very recently is even collateral damage in this area. Foreign banks are finding themselves increasingly under pressure by the United States government not to finance exports to, say, Iran. These banks are having difficulty making the distinction between transactions we would prefer not to occur and transactions that have an OFAC license. And so we have American companies doing business with Iran or Sudan pursuant to Treasury authorization, pursuant to a license, who can't get bank financing for that transaction because their bank, in a side conversation with the Treasury Department, has been urged not to finance any transactions with that particular country. These are all things that need to be sorted out. They are an example, however, from our point of view, of as you get into these things in an ever more sophisticated way, they all have ripple effects. They all have unintended consequences. They all have collateral damage. And I think to conclude back where I began, to the extent that we would differ slightly with the book is we would spend more time, given who we represent at the NFTC, talking about the collateral damage and the costs rather than the benefits. Thank you. Okay.
Bill, thank you. I'll ask Barry to be a little briefer, if you will, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I will be, and I'll stay here in the audience, given the Gus group up there up front. First thing, I just wanted to second Fred's comments and Bill's comments about the quality and importance of this study. It's truly extraordinary analysis. I had the good fortune of writing a book on the laws, I'm a law professor at Georgetown, the laws of economic sanctions after the first edition came out. And I've done some supplementary studies based on their work. And there's no way that one can write in this field today in any rigorous way without relying, looking carefully at the sanctions books put out by Gary, Jeff, Kimberly, and now Barbara. So it's just extraordinary. I'm going to be a scholar here and really just ask two questions because I'm still trying to learn and I haven't had a chance to read your new edition. First on the question of unwinding sanctions that Jeff ended with. My first question is Cuba. Do the U.S. economic sanctions against Cuba today really have any economic impact? Because other countries don't have sanctions and Cuba's had plenty of time to substitute goods. My second question goes to targeted sanctions, and Bill Reich just raised some very interesting questions, but when you said in your study that targeted sanctions are no more successful than other sanctions, first of all, I think that's a very interesting conclusion, because the smart sanctions are kind of the sanctions du jour. Everyone likes the idea of smart sanctions today, and here you've pointed out some of that they're not any more effective, and Bill's pointed out the problems. But that said, these smart sanctions, targeted sanctions, really have very little cost, except maybe some administrative costs that Bill mentioned, compared to, say, economic export controls, which shoot yourself in the foot often with jobs and the like. So if you're fashioning sanctions today as a policymaker, like for Zimbabwe, or maybe next steps on Iran, it would seem to me that you should just start with a package of smart sanctions. They don't cost much, and they could affect things. North Korea, you know, the luxury goods sanctions against the leadership, and then freezing assets of the Chinese bank in Macau, I think it was, probably helped on the North Korean situation. So I'm just thinking, if you're a policymaker now in a new administration, you pull smart sanctions off the shelf and then you add others, that they still have a lot of benefits because of their low cost.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, who wants to take Cuba and then smart sanctions? Gary?
Thanks. I'll take them both as the designated hitter, at least for the first round. On Cuba, our hope would be that there's somebody in the State Department or the CIA or someplace who is looking at the unwinding question despite the politics of the moment. We read the papers, we know the politics, we know that Florida is a key state in any election, but still there should be somebody thinking about it who is not muzzled by these political forces. And secondly, yes, they do matter for Cuba. They matter a lot. Cuba is quite close to the United States. Culturally and geographically, it is not North Korea, where the removal of sanctions has hardly, at least the Trading with the Enemy Act has hardly any impact for a lot of reasons. But with Cuba, there's a potential enormous amount of trade that would take place, and also investment if the sanctions are lifted. So there's a lot of carrot embodied in that very heavy stick, and so when the new administration comes in, hopefully they have some templates and thinking about, always mindful of the New Jersey and the Florida political dynamics. On targeted sanctions, yes, Barry, you're certainly right. I mean, you can turn that 7 out of 20 statistic around and say, well, they're no worse than other sanctions, and as you said, the cost is low. But I think you have to, and here it's a little bit jocular, but you have to take into mind that we've got Eric Hirschhorn in the audience, and he doesn't get any legal business if you just have targeted sanctions. He does with a heavy-duty kind, as well as I'm sure many other lawyers here. So we want to keep these people fully employed. But no, the more serious point is the one that Jeff made towards the end. Yes, targeted sanctions are just fine if your basic intent is to demonstrate to the U.S. constituency or the British constituency or whomever that you are doing something. And you don't want to, have a high cost, but boy, you think this is a serious business and we're going to put these names on the list and so forth and so on. And if that's the purpose, yes, but to think that targeted sanctions, let's just take a case of the moment that Jeff and Kim didn't talk much about Burma. To think that targeted sanctions against these generals will make any difference, or we can't even spell the names, and we don't know where their accounts are in Hong Kong or Shanghai or wherever, and we are not going to be able to squeeze them very hard. And they don't send their kids to St. Albans, surprisingly enough. So that's not a realistic proposition for a heavy-duty case such as Burma, though it might make some people out in Illinois happy.
Okay, floor is open for questions and comments. Please identify yourself and fire away.
Hi, my name is Jarrett Blanc. I'm with the Open Society Institute. I really have a comment, which is that hitting a baseball is very difficult. If you can do it 1 out of 3 times, you're going to be pretty pleased with yourself. Convincing antagonistic autocratic regime to change its fundamental governance is probably still more difficult. If you can do it 23% of the times with this policy, I guess I would challenge the panel to point to another policy which is substantially more effective, certainly at this cost.
I'll take one more question, then I'm going to turn all the rest over to Barbara. Well, you remember that we did send troops down to bring Mr. Noriega back, and I think he's still sitting in prison. And we sent troops down to Haiti, and we have sent troops elsewhere, and we've used the CIA a lot. If you read Tom Weiner's book, he says we've used it a couple hundred times in the past several decades, and he only covers a small fraction of the cases and basically the ones that didn't succeed, but probably in a lot of the cases we did get success. So there are other policy tools against autocrats and against folk we don't like, and maybe you don't like those tools, and maybe I don't like those tools, but to say that there are no other tools is wrong. Second point, I agree with you. We tried to make the point, I think Kim made it in her opening statement, that 1/3 or even 23% against autocrats is not bad, particularly if you don't want to use these other tools which are quite costly in many senses.
Okay, Ernie?
Ernie Prigg, Manufacturers Alliance, and I did a study a few years back on sanctions. Bill Reinsch, if you may recall, the title was Feeling Good or Doing Good with Sanctions, and I think that still applies to some extent. I have two questions, one very quick, the other. Well, the quick one is just on the success rate, 33% roughly, how does that break down for the U.S. in terms of unilateral versus multilateral sanctions? The presumption being it would be lower success on unilateral. And the other question, a little more complicated, is the question really, do you succeed or fail? But isn't there also a question, in some cases, do you make matters worse by applying sanctions? And I have two countries in mind in my response to. One is Cuba. And incidentally, trade is not just merchandise, it's services trade, namely tourist, which is probably the biggest adverse impact. But one could say, as we pursued in Vietnam and elsewhere, that if we had open trade and travel with Cuba, we would be doing better in terms of political change down there over the years. So is there a legitimate question of when sanctions make the status quo worse? The other one is Burma, which again are targeted sanctions. We shut down some apparel plants, and thousands of poor people were then destitute. Meanwhile, China moved in, and other Asian countries. So might that also be a situation where our sanctions not only did not succeed, but they made matters worse?
Trying to find the table on unilateral versus multilateral, and like with the general change over time, those changed over time, and so my recollection is that actually in that early period, the early post-war period, U.S. unilateral sanctions were maybe even successful to the tune of around 60%, so a little bit higher actually than overall, but in the more recent period then much, much less successful. And I think for the more recent period it was under 1 in 5 as compared to 1 in 4 for the 70s and 80s, and they're just much less common in the 90s. So so it is true that it's almost true that you could say for the the 70s and 80s and 90s that U.S. unilateral sanctions almost never work. But in that earlier period, again, when the U.S. was pretty dominant and maybe was more selective in its use of sanctions, actually even then it was able to have some success.
Do sanctions make things worse? Yes, that's what they're designed to do. And
I mean, for our purposes, for our objectives, that would be worse than pursuing democratization.
then it depends on what happens in the target country and in the sender country. And it's a question of sustainability. And that is why you have to ask many more questions than do sanctions make things worse to understand whether the costs and benefits match up correctly. So essentially what you're asking is, do the costs justify the expected benefits? And in many cases, the answer is probably not. And that argues for a restructuring of the type of actions that are taken against the target country. In those respects, then the trend towards more targeted sanctions may make sense if you're trying to signal displeasure and don't expect the sanctions to have a highly coercive effect. And that would limit the collateral damage in the target country and would also limit the damage to domestic workers and firms that if it gets too much with seemingly no U.S. benefit deriving from it, would lead people to say, well, this isn't worth it, we should get out of this mess. It hasn't happened with regard to Cuba yet. I think that's a rather special political situation. But even in South Florida, if you go today, there is a growing debate in the Cuban community about whether it is better to maintain the harsh regime or begin to add carrots to the sticks.
But I can't resist adding, and you'll remember this, that shortly after the Cuban sanctions were ratcheted up a decade or so ago in the famous Helmsburton Act, that the Congress sent a study group to Havana to see what the impact was. And they came back and said it should be renamed the Helmsburton Castro Act, because even the opponents of Castro supported him in resisting the U.S. sanctions. So I think the point is, may the domestic opposition to a targeted regime join the targeted regime by virtue of nationalist reaction to the foreign sanctions. And that's the kind of thing that I think you were referring to, and can certainly happen. Howard.
I have a question for the original three authors. Jeff said that the results of the first study seemed to continue to be robust. Were there any of your 10 commandments that fell out? The original 10 commandments.
They don't remember the 10 commandments. This is like asking Moses 25 years later.
I remind you, I was going to be right.
If number 6 can be excised.
We reorganized them. I don't recall that we actually dropped any, although I don't have the two lists actually in my head. The one thing I will maybe comment on that the emphasis shifted over time was on this issue of international cooperation, where in the first one we just sort of looked overall at the average, and there was a negative correlation. So we sort of concluded that the costs of trying to get that cooperation perhaps outweighed the benefits. And as we sort of dug into it more over time and with more cases, and actually and the correlation changed a bit, came to this more nuanced conclusion that it depends on what your goals are, that one of the reasons it was negative in the overall average correlation was because the U.S. wasn't even seeking cooperation in some of those earlier cases when it was dominant or the goals were modest. And then, of course, in the major cases, it is often necessary but may still be insufficient. So that's one where we clearly did sort of shift the emphasis, but I can't think of any that we flat out dropped. It was more a question of reorganizing and changing the emphasis of the conclusions and recommendations.
I should also note that we never had 10 commandments. That number was copyrighted a long time ago, so we only had 9 commandments at the time.
The 9 commandments. There was a question over here.
Ray Albright, AMB Finance. It was more just a methodology question about when did you measure success? In other words, is this when sanctions were lifted? So sort of over what time period did you decide it was now ripe to measure the results?
Thanks, Ray. A good question. We measured it generally at the latest time. So to give the example that might be in your mind, in our first edition, South Africa was still underway, and apartheid was still well in place, well entrenched, and we rated those sanctions as a failure. Now, later, the current edition, we rate them as a marginal success. And I could go into the reasons why the qualification marginal, but they are in the success column. So we measured it at the latest time. The exception being that some of these very long-running cases, and Cuba and North Korea are outstanding in that respect, there are multiple phases, as Kim said, and so some of the phases we actually saw some interim success, and we would have seen, and it actually got concluded. So a case in point, Cuba withdrew its troops from Africa quite some time ago, and that did get a success, and that's, will not be changed by the other dimensions or the other phases of the case.
Okay, Eric, get the last question.
I'll make it a quick one. And that is a question about the premise. Question about the premise of your measurement of success. How much of it, I guess, how can you distinguish things that might have happened anyway, things that happened for other reasons, because sanctions are rarely imposed without lots of other diplomatic things going on, military threats, other economic issues. How can you isolate the effect of sanctions in the cases where you deem there to have been a success?
Well, Eric, that's why you have 3 people up here. And that's why we intrude on your space, which is, a legal judgment type of area. I mean, truly, this is not an area, and you are right. There are the multiple things going on, and we did our best in terms of applying econometrics, but I don't think the econometrics tease it out, or at least the econometrics we applied. I'll give you a little bit longer answer in just a moment, because better econometrics are always coming on. But I think at the end of the day, it will be a judgmental question, and certainly other people will come to very different judgments. I'm going to cite you one and then come to some recent research. Our colleague, Richard Cooper, who was very much involved in the Afghan, going way back, these are the Carter administration grain embargo against Afghanistan, which we rated a failure. He said, no, you're wrong on that, because that grain embargo taught the Soviets a lesson that they shouldn't, be sending their troops out to other parts of the world. Well, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but he strongly believed that was a demonstration effect, which I was always very skeptical of, and we still rated a failure in this third edition. However, there's a very bright scholar who just graduated from Harvard, who looked at our data and looked at the correlates of war data set and found, lo and behold, that when you sanction a country, the chances of that country or a country with similar characteristics engaging in military action in the next 5 years are significantly reduced. So, there it is. But it's hard to tease out, and we basically use a judgmental method, not a econometric, to answer your question.
Okay, thanks to all for coming. Thanks particularly to the authors. Meeting adjourned.
Really, Jeff. This is really spectacular.